Okay. Testing.
Okay.
All right. All right. I think, can you hear me now, Rebecca? Okay. All right. There was something going on with my earbuds and I don't know what it was. Well, it makes me want to go back and redo everything that I just said. And I think I will. Go back to verse 53. I'm not going to reread. You can do that on your own. But go back over to Mark chapter 14, 53, and 53 and 54. I'll set up the scene, what's going on here. Judas has done the deed. Jesus has been arrested. He's going to be brought before the Sanhedrin. And the disciples have all forsaken him at this point. But he's following Jesus at a distance. He's not following him anymore like he would have been. He is just kind of trailing him. He's coming into the courtyard, setting around the fire, just trying to blend in with all the rest of the servants. And he kind of wants to know what's happening. He cares. He cares what's going to happen to Jesus. He loves Jesus very much. And so he sits down around this fire. And again, this is one of those sandwich stories. You have what's going on with Peter here in these verses. And then eventually, as you go back to verse 66, we're going to see later on, if we have enough time, you can go back and see that there's something, you can see what happens as Peter's setting around this fire. We'll talk about maybe later on if we have enough time. But as you get to verse 55, we have this trial by the Jews. It's not really a fair trial. We have in our country where we say somebody's innocent until proven guilty. In other words, you take all the evidence, you collect it up, and then you see what the verdict is. But what's going on here, they've already figured out the verdict, and they're trying to get all the evidence to fit what they've already determined, that he's guilty of blasphemy and he's guilty against the law. You think about it, as you think about a trial, one of the most important elements of a trial is your witnesses. And so that's exactly what they're going to do here. They're going to call some witnesses. But according to Mark, he calls them false witnesses. You have all these people throwing out all these accusations. And according to Matthew's account, they're stirring up these false witnesses to come. So they're trying to provoke people to make some kind of accusation towards Jesus. And one of the accusations that they made towards him is that he was going to tear down the temple and rebuild one in 3 days. You think they understood what he meant, what he meant when he said that? Because Jesus said that. They're right. See, Jesus isn't talking about the physical temple, although there are other times when he talks about not a stone being left upon another. We'll come back to that in a minute. But they didn't understand what he was talking about. He's talking about his temple, his body. It was going to be torn down, and 3 days later, it was going to be resurrected. But they have all these witnesses trying to throw mud at the wall, trying to see what they can get to stick, and they can't even get 2 or 3 witnesses to agree. In the Old Testament, you had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to convict somebody before you put people to death. That was part of the law, where somebody would break the law, they break the Sabbath, or they break some portion of the law. A lot of times they would be stoned and put to death. So you had to have 2 or 3 people to collaborate some kind of story in order to put somebody to death. That makes a lot of sense. But here they can't even get it to work. They can't even get people to agree on anything. It makes you wonder why they're even having the trial in the first place. Like, why are they even wasting their time with it? I wonder, though, I wonder if it's not just kind of to satisfy their own conscience, but wonder if it's not also to try to satisfy the crowd. They're already worried about an uprising, some kind of revolt, trying to arrest and put Jesus to death because he's super popular. You have all these people in town for the Passover celebrating it, and if they go out of step on something, people are going to have some kind of, they're going to have something to say about that. They're going to have an issue. But as the high priest has been listening to all these testimonies, can't get any of them to agree with each other, he decides he's going to take things into his own hands. And so in verse 58 or in verse 60, the high priest stood up in the midst of them and asked Jesus, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" Does he really have to give an answer? Like they can't get anybody to agree. So there's really no accusation that's true that they've brought up against him. He doesn't have to give an answer to any of this because number one, none of it matters. None of it really matters. Although, don't you think if Jesus was to stand up and give an account of himself to make some kind of a testimony against what they were saying, do you think he could prove himself to be innocent of all of that? But he goes on and asks him further. When Jesus didn't say anything, he asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" I'll tell you what, Jesus didn't have to answer anything. If he would have just remained silent, then nothing would have happened. They can't get any of the testimony to work out. They wouldn't be able to get him to agree on anything. He could have left that trial possibly without anything, but he does answer, and he answers in a way that he knows is going to be upsetting to them. Because what does he say? He says, I am the Messiah. You're right. And he says, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of the coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, wow, like what does that mean? What is he trying to tell them? Because they get really upset by this. I'll show you a couple passages. If you turn over to Daniel 7, one of the big reasons why Jesus calling himself the Son of Man mattered was because of what Daniel said back in Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, look there in verse 13. We're looking at a passage that's dealing with judgments. You got the four beasts and the judgments on the four beasts. And as you get down to Daniel 7, you see that there's going to be this king that would come. Daniel has this vision. In verse 13, he says, "And behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed." So you have all these kingdoms in Daniel 7 being destroyed and having judgments on them, but then you have this one king that comes in the clouds has this reign and this kingdom that lasts forever. Now, I'll prove to you that this is a judgment passage, because if you just go over to Mark chapter 13, and look at verse 24, Jesus, as you get closer to Jerusalem, as you get closer to him being crucified, he becomes more and more blatant about God's judgment on them. And at the very beginning of Mark 13, Jesus tells his disciples that, they were saying, well, look at all these beautiful buildings. And he says, well, not one stone's going to be left upon another. And down in Mark 13, verse 24, he says, in those days, talking about the days of the judgment on Jerusalem, which we know happened about 40 years after the time in which Jesus spoke these words. In that generation, he says previously, or later after this, in that generation, all these things would take place. But he says in those days, after that tribulation, talking about Romans' judgment on Israel, he says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. All of that being borrowed or recycled apostolic language from the Old Testament and judgment on nations and kings. And he says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And and then he will send his angels and gather together the elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of the heaven, all of which borrowed language from the Old Testament, all of which talking about Jesus coming in judgment on Jerusalem. Of course, it was a symbolic coming of Jesus, not a literal coming of Jesus. But I think as he says this in the trial, I think what he's really saying is, you're right. I am the Son of Man. I am the Messiah, and I'm going to come in judgment. You're going to see me coming in the clouds, not in a literal sense, but in a judgment sense. You're going to see me coming in the clouds, and I'm going to judge all of you. I tell you what, that's exactly what happened. 40 years from the point Jesus says this, Jesus would come in judgment. Symbolically, he would come in judgment on Jerusalem. And the very temple that they were in was going to be destroyed, was going to be torn down. And I think that's why we see such a strong reaction from the high priest. Because in verse 63 says the high priest tore his clothes. He says, we don't have a need for this trial anymore. You've heard blasphemy. And that's exactly how they conclude this sham of a trial. And so what did they do? They began to spit on him, slap him. I think another version says they blindfolded him, which it says it here, but they blindfolded him, then they slapped him, and then they said, prophesy, who hit you? Tell us who hit you. If you're such a great prophet. If you, and I think that's why they were so upset here. And I'll tell you what, one of the biggest reasons why they hated Jesus so much was his claim to being the Messiah. I and my Father are one. You reject me, you reject him. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. One of the biggest points of hatred towards Jesus was his claim to be the Messiah. So that leads us to verse 66. Again, in verse 53 and 54, Peter's been kind of following Jesus at a distance. He wants to know what happened, but he's not willing to, as he declared earlier, when Jesus said, you're going to deny me 3 times, he says, no, even if I have to be put on the cross with you, Jesus, this is not going to happen. And even though previously when they arrested him, Peter took out one of the 2 swords that they had with them, and he was going to fight them off, and he cuts off the ear of the high priest, Malchus, the servant of the high priest. And despite all of that, Peter is not willing to stand with Jesus in this moment. And let's go ahead and read 66 to 72. It says, now as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and when she saw Peter warming himself, looked at him and said, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you're saying. And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, this is one of them. But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it. And he began to curse and swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the words of Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And when he had thought about it, he wept. All right, so think about the events that took place here. Think about the details. In 67 and 68, he's in the courtyard by the fire, and this little servant girl says to him, you were with Jesus of Nazareth. And did Peter fully deny Jesus here? Like, if you were just to evaluate those words himself, I think you could come to the conclusion, no, he didn't all out deny him. I think he knew what she was saying, but then he just says, I don't know what you're talking about. Did he really? Yeah, I think he did. And so he lied. But maybe you could rationalize his words here and say, well, he didn't really deny Jesus. He just said, I don't know what you're talking about. But in verses 69 to 67, I believe he did. I believe he did deny Jesus. I think he knew exactly what she was saying. And he's saying, I don't know what you're talking about, me being with him. He goes to the porch, and this time, and here's the rooster crows. This time, the servant girl said, "You're one of them," and he denied it. He denied it. He denied ever knowing Jesus. I can't imagine. But another time, the rest of the people started saying, "You're a Galilean." How did they know he was Galilean? By the very words that he spoke. Accents are really interesting. As small as Israel was, the accents change within the region in which someone would be. Is that way really anywhere. I was in Kentucky for a little while. Go down to southern Kentucky, becomes real thick, and you go to the northern Kentucky, it's not nearly as thick. It's just the way that it works. They knew because of his accent and the things that he said. It's interesting. His very statement of denial is what gave him away. The more he talked, the more he kind of dug himself in a hole here. And then in verse 71, he began to curse and to swear, "I do not know this man in whom you speak." I don't know. This is one of the saddest scenes in the Bible. Can you imagine saying, "I swear upon God, upon heaven, that I don't know this man"? It'd be like saying, "I swear upon God, I don't know his son." One of the saddest statements ever made. Peter just went from a rock to sand in this moment, just this weakness. And I think, it makes you wonder, how could Peter have been so confident previously and become so weak here? I'll tell you what, there's just different moments, different times when we are stronger, maybe in some of the harder moments, but weaker in some of the more easier moments. And I think Peter struggled with a few things in his life. You're not always consistent in your bravery. That's why we're warned, take heed when you stand, lest you fall. The idea is that sometimes when you feel like you're the strongest, you can be in your weakest moment. After having great victories, you can fall to some of the smallest things. You're not always going to win every battle. And I think that's just true about us. Sometimes you have more courage in some moments, and yet you're weaker in others. But I think Peter really struggled in his life with being a man pleaser. If you think about Peter and think about Galatians 2, like in Acts 10 and 11, he stood up for the Gentiles. He's determined that no one can deny the Gentiles salvation. But when you get to Galatians 2, he's eating with the Jews and not eating with the Gentiles, and Paul has to confront him face to face. Peter, like some of us, struggle with being men pleasers rather than God pleasers. And we've got to guard against ourselves against that. And I think that's part of what Peter's struggle is here. If he put himself next to Jesus in this trial, he's going to be right there with him. But I love how the Gospels continue out to say, even when Jesus resurrected from the dead, he tells the women, he tells Mary to tell the disciples and Peter. Peter was going to need special encouragement. In John 21, Jesus comes back. He's resurrected. He's spending time with them alongside of the sea, around a fire again. And he asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "I love you. I love you." He says, "Feed my sheep." I've got work for you to do, Peter. I know you betrayed me. I know you turned your back on me in this, but I have work, and you're going to be a big part of that. And he was. He would open the door to the Jews, and later on, he would open the door to the Gentiles. So that's our study this morning. A lot of really encouraging things, a lot of sad things, but a lot of encouraging things, knowing that the apostles, even though they denied him, they turned their back on him. And Peter even denying knowing him 3 times before the rooster crowed twice. Peter would take a huge role in the gospel being spread and souls being saved because Jesus didn't give up on him. Lots to take from that. I hope that's helpful, and encourage you to take time, read that on your own, and kind of meditate on that. Think about that through your rest of your day. But thank you to everybody who participated. Thank you for letting me know you couldn't hear me, because I would have done the whole show without anybody being able to know what I said. So appreciate that, Rebecca. But everybody have a great day, and God bless.